Here's what we're talking about today, and I want to say it clearly from the very beginning. This video is about how men try to get a woman back when she's emotionally checked out, or saying she's no longer interested, and why most of what you've been taught to do actually makes things worse. I'm not speaking as a hype coach or someone selling fantasy. I'm speaking as a therapist who has spent years sitting across from men who are confused, ashamed, hopeful, and quietly hurting. Welcome back to the channel. Now, here's the part that will sound controversial, and I want you to sit with it for a moment. You don't get a woman back by chasing her, convincing her, or proving anything to her. In fact, every time a man tries to win her back directly, he usually pushes her further away. I've watched this pattern play out in countless therapy rooms. Different men, different relationships, same outcome. Many of the men I've worked with believe they lost the relationship because they didn't say the right words or didn't fight hard enough. What they eventually discovered, sometimes painfully, is that attraction doesn't respond to pressure. It responds to emotional safety, self-respect, and change that's felt, not announced. When a woman says she's not interested anymore, most men hear rejection. What's often really happening is emotional exhaustion. She's already processed the relationship internally, while he's just beginning to panic. That gap creates desperation on one side and resistance on the other. And desperation, no matter how well-intentioned, never feels attractive. As a therapist, I've seen men unintentionally talk themselves out of a second chance by over-explaining, apologizing endlessly, or trying to negotiate love like a contract. I've also seen men who did something very different. They stopped trying to control the outcome. They focused inward. They regulated their emotions. They rebuilt their sense of self. And interestingly, those were the moments when reconnection sometimes became possible. This video isn't about tricks. It's not about forcing interest where it doesn't exist. It's about understanding why attraction fades, how emotional dynamics actually work, and what gives you the best chance of genuine reconnection without losing your dignity. Stay with me. This may challenge what you believe, but it will give you clarity. 1. Why chasing her pushes her further away. Why chasing her pushes her further away is something I've had to explain gently many times to men who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. From their perspective, chasing feels logical. If you care, you show it. If something is slipping away, you reach for it. That instinct makes sense emotionally. But emotionally driven behavior isn't the same as emotionally effective behavior. In my experience as a therapist, the moment a man starts chasing is usually the moment he stops being emotionally grounded. His focus shifts from connection to control. He's no longer responding to the relationship as it is, but reacting to the fear of losing it. That fear leaks into everything. The texts become longer, the explanations more detailed, the apologies heavier, the urgency louder, and while he feels like he's showing commitment, what she often feels is pressure. Pressure doesn't register as love, it registers as obligation. When someone feels emotionally cornered, their natural response is to create space, not closeness. I've seen women pull away not because they didn't care, but because they felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing someone else's emotions. Attraction rarely survives that dynamic. What chasing really communicates, even when it's unintentional, is I need you to feel okay. That's a heavy message to carry. Healthy attraction grows when two people choose each other freely, not when one person is trying to convince the other to stay. The more a man chases, the more he hands over his emotional balance, and the more uneven the dynamic becomes. I remember sitting across from a man who told me with complete sincerity, "If I just explain myself better, she'll understand and come back." What he didn't realize was that understanding wasn't the problem. She understood him perfectly. What she no longer felt was emotional polarity. His constant pursuit had flattened the dynamic into something that felt more like reassurance, seeking, than connection. Chasing also keeps a man stuck in the past version of the relationship. He's trying to restore what was instead of addressing what changed. From a therapeutic standpoint, that's one of the biggest blind spots. Relationships don't restart by replaying old patterns louder. They only shift when someone changes internally, not performatively, but genuinely. When a man stops chasing, something important happens. His nervous system begins to calm. He starts responding instead of reacting. He regains a sense of self that isn't dependent on her response. That shift is subtle, but it's powerful. If reconnection is possible, it almost always starts there. Chasing feels active, but it's actually avoidance. It avoids sitting with discomfort, uncertainty, and self-reflection. Stepping back isn't giving up, it's choosing stability over panic. And ironically, stability is the one thing chasing never provides. 2. What not interested really means emotionally. What not interested really means emotionally is often very different from how men hear it. Most men hear those words as a final verdict, a door slammed shut, a rejection of who they are. From a therapeutic point of view, that interpretation is understandable, but it's also incomplete. When a woman says she's not interested anymore, she's usually describing an internal emotional state, not delivering a punishment or making a calculated move. In my experience working with men, this phrase almost always comes after a long period of emotional processing on her side. She didn't wake up one morning and suddenly decide she was done. More often, she slowly disengaged while still physically present. She thought about it quietly. She weighed her feelings. By the time she says it out loud, she's already tired. And emotional fatigue changes how attraction functions. Many men assume not interested means there is no attraction left at all. What it usually means is that the attraction no longer feels safe, light, or rewarding. Attraction doesn't disappear because of one mistake. It fades when a relationship starts to feel emotionally draining, predictable, or heavy. When interactions revolve around tension, reassurance, conflict, or unspoken resentment, interest doesn't vanish. It shuts down to protect her emotional energy. One thing I often explain in sessions is that attraction is not maintained through effort alone. You can be loyal, consistent, and well-intentioned, and still lose emotional traction if the dynamic becomes unbalanced. When a man begins to rely on the relationship for his emotional regulation, she often senses it before he does. That sense of responsibility can quietly erode desire. Not interested can also be a boundary, not a verdict. It's a way of saying, I don't feel the way I used to, and I don't have the capacity to keep trying in this state. Men sometimes try to argue against this, thinking logic or proof will change the feeling. But feelings don't respond to debate. They respond to shifts in emotional experience over time. From a therapeutic lens, the most important thing men need to understand is that interest is fluid. It responds to how someone feels around you, not just how you treat them. If being with you feels calm, grounded, and emotionally safe, interest has room to breathe. If it feels tense, heavy, or pressured, interest retreats. When men learn to hear not interested as information instead of rejection, everything changes. It becomes a signal to look inward rather than push outward. Not to convince, but to understand. Not to perform change, but to embody it. That distinction is what separates men who stay stuck from men who actually grow, whether reconnection happens or not. 3. The mistake men make when they try to fix everything. The mistake men make when they try to fix everything is assuming that relationships break because something obvious went wrong, and that if they just identify it and repair it quickly enough, everything will return to normal. From the outside, that sounds reasonable. From years of therapeutic work, I can tell you it's one of the most damaging assumptions a man can make. When a man enters fix-it mode, he usually believes he's being responsible. He reflects, he apologizes, he promises change, He explains his intentions in detail. He may even list the things he's working on. But emotionally, what he's doing is responding to fear, not clarity. And fear-driven repair almost always feels overwhelming to the other person. I've watched men exhaust themselves trying to become perfect versions of who they think she wants. They adjust their behavior overnight, become hyper-attentive, overly agreeable, and constantly available. They call this effort. What she often experiences is inconsistency. Not because the changes aren't real, but because they're rushed and fueled by anxiety rather than grounded self-awareness. One of the hardest things for men to hear in therapy is this: you cannot fix an emotional disconnect with explanations or promises. Emotional connection isn't restored by logic, it's restored by experience, by how it feels to be around you now, not how convincingly you describe who you're becoming. Another part of this mistake is timing. Men tend to want resolution immediately. They want reassurance, clarity, and closure as fast as possible, because uncertainty is uncomfortable. But emotional healing doesn't follow deadlines. When a man keeps pushing for conversations, check-ins, or confirmations that things are getting better, he unintentionally keeps reopening the wound instead of allowing it to settle. There's also a deeper layer I see often. Trying to fix everything becomes a way to avoid sitting with guilt, grief, or loss of control. Action feels safer than stillness. Doing feels safer than reflecting. But growth happens in the quiet moments, when a man stops performing improvement and starts genuinely examining his patterns, his emotional responses, and his sense of self outside the relationship. The men who eventually create real change don't announce it. They don't negotiate it. They live it. They slow down. They regulate their emotions. They stop making the relationship the center of their identity. And paradoxically, that's when their presence begins to feel different. Trying to fix everything is often about regaining comfort, not rebuilding connection. Letting go of that impulse doesn't mean giving up. It means choosing depth over panic. And that choice changes everything, whether the relationship continues or not. 4. How emotional pressure destroys attraction. How emotional pressure destroys attraction becomes very clear when you look at it through the lens of someone who is already in a relationship, not just someone trying to get back into one. I've worked with many men who were technically still partnered, still talking, still trying, yet emotionally the relationship was already fragile. What they didn't realize was that their pressure, even when subtle, was slowly eroding what attraction was left. Imagine a man who notices his partner becoming distant. She replies slower. She seems less present. Instead of pausing to understand what's happening emotionally, he leans in harder. He asks more questions. He wants reassurance. He brings up the relationship more often. He checks in repeatedly to see where he stands. From his perspective, he's being caring. From her perspective, the relationship starts to feel like a responsibility she has to manage. Emotional pressure doesn't always look like demands or arguments. Often it looks like constant seriousness. Every interaction carries weight. Every conversation feels like it's leading somewhere heavy. I've had men tell me, "I just wanted us to talk things through." But when talking becomes frequent, intense, and emotionally loaded, it stops feeling like connection and starts feeling like work. In relationships, attraction thrives on emotional freedom. When someone feels they can show up without being responsible for stabilizing the other person's emotions, they relax. When they feel watched, monitored, or subtly depended on, they tense up. That tension is the beginning of emotional withdrawal. One man I worked with was still living with his partner, still sharing daily life, but she had emotionally shut down. He couldn't understand how he could be physically present and still feel so far away. What became clear over time was that every interaction carried an unspoken request. "Please reassure me that we're okay." She felt that request even when he didn't say it out loud. Pressure also removes playfulness. curiosity, and lightness. Relationships need emotional breathing room. When everything becomes about fixing, defining, or securing the bond, attraction has no space to regenerate. It's not that she doesn't care, it's that she doesn't feel free. From a therapeutic standpoint, the most damaging aspect of emotional pressure is that it's often invisible to the person applying it. Men don't intend to suffocate connection, they're trying to save it. But attraction doesn't respond to effort alone. It responds to emotional safety, steadiness, and self-contained confidence. When a man in a relationship learns to regulate his own emotions, slow down, and stop asking the relationship to constantly prove itself, something shifts. The pressure lifts, the dynamic softens, and only then does attraction have a chance to return, not because it was forced, but because it finally had room to breathe. 5. The power of stepping back without disappearing. The power of stepping back without disappearing is something I often explain to men who are still in a relationship but feel like they're slowly losing their partner. This is one of the most misunderstood ideas because many men think stepping back means becoming cold, distant, or playing games. From a therapeutic perspective, stepping back is none of those things. It's about restoring balance without creating abandonment. Consider a man who notices that his partner has become emotionally withdrawn. Conversations feel shorter, affection feels forced. His instinct is to close the gap by being more present, more available, more involved. But when one person moves closer while the other is pulling away, the distance actually increases. Stepping back interrupts that cycle. In relationships, emotional space is not the enemy of connection. It's often the condition that allows it to recover. When a man steps back in a healthy way, he stops over-monitoring the relationship. He stops checking for signs. He stops asking questions that are really requests for reassurance. This shift isn't loud, but it's deeply felt. I've seen men who stayed physically present and emotionally respectful, but stopped centering every interaction around the state of the relationship. They focused on their routines, their work, their sense of purpose. They didn't withdraw affection, but they stopped using affection as a tool to stabilize their own anxiety. That distinction matters more than most men realize. Stepping back also changes how a man shows up emotionally. Instead of reacting to every change in tone or mood, he becomes more grounded. He listens without trying to fix. He responds without urgency. For someone in a relationship, this can feel like relief. The emotional load lightens. The constant sense of being evaluated or leaned on fades. One important thing I emphasize in therapy is that stepping back is not about sending a message to her. It's about changing your internal posture. When that posture shifts, the dynamic follows naturally. She may not immediately respond, but over time, the relationship begins to feel less tense, less heavy. In long-term relationships especially, attraction doesn't disappear overnight. It dims under pressure and re-emerges in safety. Stepping back creates that safety by allowing both people to exist as individuals again, not as emotional regulators for one another. For men who are afraid that giving space means losing her, this idea feels risky. But what's often riskier is continuing to apply pressure in the hope that effort alone will bring closeness back. Stepping back without disappearing is not passive. It's intentional restraint. And in many relationships, that restraint is exactly what restores balance and opens the door for genuine reconnection. 6. Rebuilding self-respect before rebuilding the connection. Rebuilding self-respect before rebuilding the connection is often the turning point for men who are still in a relationship but feel like they've lost their footing. I've sat with many men who were technically still together with their partner, yet internally felt diminished, anxious and unsure of who they were becoming inside the relationship. What's important to understand is that attraction rarely survives when self-respect quietly erodes. In relationships, self-respect isn't about dominance or emotional distance. It's about how a man relates to himself when things feel uncertain. When a man begins to tolerate behavior that makes him feel small, constantly doubts his worth, or abandons his boundaries to keep the peace, the relationship dynamic shifts. His partner may not consciously recognize it, but she feels the imbalance. I've worked with men who said, "I just didn't want to lose her, so I went along with everything." Over time, that strategy backfires. When a man sacrifices his values, his routines, or his voice to preserve the relationship, he often loses the very presence that made the relationship feel stable in the first place. Self-respect is sensed, not announced. In an ongoing relationship, rebuilding self-respect doesn't mean issuing ultimatums or pulling away emotionally. It means re-anchoring yourself internally. It looks like honoring your time, your goals, and your emotional limits. Again, it looks like speaking calmly instead of suppressing resentment. It looks like choosing not to over-explain yourself or chase validation when you feel uncertain. One man I worked with was still sharing a home with his partner, yet felt invisible. He realized that over time, he had stopped doing the things that made him feel capable and grounded. His world had narrowed to the relationship alone. When he slowly rebuilt his routines, his friendships, and his sense of direction, something unexpected happened. The emotional tension in the relationship eased, not because he demanded change, but because his presence changed. Self-respect creates emotional stability, and emotional stability creates safety. In relationships, safety is what allows attraction to return naturally. When a man respects himself, he no longer needs constant reassurance. He no longer reacts defensively to distance. He becomes steady, which allows his partner to relax emotionally. From a therapeutic standpoint, this is one of the hardest shifts for men because it requires patience. You don't rebuild self-respect to get a reaction. You rebuild it because it's necessary for your well-being, whether the relationship deepens or ends. That internal work never goes to waste. Trying to rebuild a connection without rebuilding self-respect is like trying to stabilize a structure on uneven ground. When the foundation is restored, everything above it has a chance to realign. 7. When letting go creates the only real chance. When letting go creates the only real chance. It often sounds paradoxical to men who are still in a relationship and trying to hold things together. Letting go is usually interpreted as giving up, withdrawing care, or emotionally checking out. From a therapeutic perspective, letting go is none of those things. It's the moment a man releases the need to control the outcome of the relationship. I've worked with men who were still partnered, still committed, yet internally consumed by fear of loss. Every interaction felt like a test. Every silence felt threatening. In that state, the relationship stops being a shared experience and starts becoming something to manage. Letting go begins when a man stops asking the relationship to constantly reassure him that it's safe. In an ongoing relationship, letting go doesn't mean neglecting your partner or becoming emotionally unavailable. It means loosening the grip of expectation. It's the shift from "this has to work" to "I can show up grounded regardless of the outcome." That internal shift changes how a man listens, responds, and carries himself. One man I worked with was still deeply invested in his relationship, but his anxiety made every conversation heavy. When he finally stopped trying to steer the relationship back to how it used to be, something softened. He listened without defending. He spoke without needing agreement. He allowed moments to be what they were, instead of what he hoped they would become. His partner noticed the difference before he did. Letting go also means accepting emotional uncertainty. Relationships go through seasons of closeness and distance. When a man resists that reality, he often tightens emotionally. When he accepts it, he becomes more present. Presence, not pressure, is what sustains connection over time. From a therapeutic lens, letting go restores dignity. It allows a man to stay emotionally open without abandoning himself. It removes the silent transaction of, "I'll be okay if you respond a certain way." That freedom is felt by both people. The relationship stops feeling like a fragile object that could break at any moment. Ironically, when men let go of trying to secure the relationship, they often become more attractive within it, not because they stopped caring, but because their care became grounded instead of anxious. They stopped clinging to the past version of the relationship and allowed space for something new to emerge. Letting go doesn't guarantee reconnection. Nothing does, but it creates the only environment where genuine connection can exist. Whether the relationship deepens or transforms, letting go allows a man to remain whole. And from that place, whatever happens next is faced with clarity instead of fear. In the end, getting a woman back isn't about chasing, convincing, or controlling her feelings. It's about understanding the emotional dynamics at play, respecting boundaries, and most importantly, reclaiming your own sense of self. Attraction thrives when you are grounded, confident, and emotionally steady, not when you're anxious or desperate. By stepping back, regulating your emotions, rebuilding self-respect, and letting go of outcomes, you create space for genuine connection to re-emerge. Whether the relationship rekindles or not, this approach ensures you remain whole, balanced, and capable of healthy, authentic relationships in the future.